For nearly 2,000 years, a child's grave sat quietly on the banks of a river in Cambodia, undisturbed and unmarked. No inscription recorded a name, no monument marked the spot. History remembers this region through its temples, its kings, and its stone inscriptions, not through the ordinary people buried in the ground beneath them, forgotten long before anyone thought to ask who they really were. Then scientists cracked open the DNA hidden inside those small bones, and what they found didn't just belong to Cambodia, it belonged to India. Nearly half of that child's entire genetic ancestry traced directly back to South Asia, thousands of kilometers away, across an open ocean that, according to almost every history book ever written, Indian people were not supposed to have crossed in meaningful numbers for centuries yet to come. A child, born and buried in Cambodia, carrying Indian DNA, at a time when the Roman Empire still ruled the Mediterranean, when the Gupta Empire had not yet risen in India, and when most historians assumed meaningful contact between India and Southeast Asia was still centuries away from beginning in earnest. Most people, when they think about ancient India's influence on the wider world, picture something relatively recent and relatively soft. The spread of Buddhism through Central Asia and into China, or the export of spices and textiles along medieval trade routes. Few people, including many historians, would have guessed that as early as the 1st century of the Common Era, decades before Rome's most famous emperors even took the throne, Indian families were already crossing an entire ocean, settling permanently in Southeast Asia, and raising children whose DNA would still be readable by scientists 2,000 years later. This is the story of how scientists found Indian DNA on the other side of the Bay of Bengal. 1,000 years earlier than anyone expected to find it, buried quietly in the bones of a child too young to have known just how far his family had traveled, to give him the life, however brief, that he lived. To understand why this discovery mattered so much to researchers, you first need to understand what historians already knew and what they didn't. For well over a century, scholars have documented what's often called the Indianization of Southeast Asia, a sweeping cultural transformation that swept across what is now Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia, beginning sometime in the first millennium of the Common Era. Sanskrit inscriptions began appearing on stone monuments. Hindu and Buddhist temples rose across the landscape, their architecture directly echoing styles from the Indian subcontinent. Local kings began adopting Sanskrit royal titles and Indian-style court rituals. The great temple complex of Angkor Wat, built centuries later, remains perhaps the most famous physical monument to just how deeply Indian religious and artistic tradition took root in Southeast Asian soil. But historians have long debated exactly how this transformation happened. Was it primarily a story of ideas and religion spreading through trade contact, carried by merchants, monks, and diplomats who came, taught, traded, and in many cases returned home, leaving behind converts rather than descendants? Or did it involve substantial numbers of Indian people actually settling permanently in Southeast Asia, marrying into local populations, and passing down their own genetic ancestry alongside their language, religion, and customs? For decades, this question was almost impossible to answer using archaeology or textual history alone, because the archaeological record of ancient Southeast Asia offers frustratingly few clues about the biological ancestry of the people who actually lived through this transformation. That's precisely the gap ancient DNA research was designed to fill, and the results, when they finally came in, answered the question far more dramatically than most researchers expected. Earlier genetic studies, conducted before ancient DNA extraction techniques, had advanced enough to work reliably in Southeast Asia's hot, humid climate. Conditions that are notoriously destructive to preserve genetic material had already found traces of South Asian ancestry scattered across modern Southeast Asian populations. Researchers studying present-day communities across the region, including the Bamar people of Myanmar, the Cham people of Vietnam and Cambodia, the Khmer people of Cambodia, Malay populations, Mon communities, and Thai populations, all showed measurable, if generally modest, levels of South Asian genetic ancestry. Using statistical techniques that estimate roughly when two populations mixed based on patterns in modern DNA, researchers had previously dated this South Asian admixture to somewhere between the 4th and 16th centuries of the Common Era, depending on the specific population studied, with Cambodia's Khmer population specifically dated to somewhere around the 12th or 13th century. Then, researchers got their hands on genuinely ancient DNA, not modern DNA used to infer an ancient event indirectly, but DNA extracted directly from human remains that had been in the ground for close to 2,000 years. The individual at the center of this discovery was recovered from a site called Vat Komnou, part of the ancient settlement of Angkor Borei in southern Cambodia, a site connected to one of Southeast Asia's earliest and most important early states, a kingdom known to history as Funan. Funan flourished along the Mekong Delta region, beginning roughly in the 1st century of the Common Era, and is widely regarded by historians as one of the very first organized political states to emerge in mainland Southeast Asia, deeply engaged in maritime trade networks that connected it to India, China, and the wider Indian Ocean trading world. Radiocarbon dating placed the individual's death within a range of the years 78 to 234 of the Common Era, meaning this person lived and died during the earliest known period of the Funan kingdom's existence. At the very beginning of the era, historians associate with Indian cultural influence beginning to take hold in the region. That dating range deserves a moment of its own context. It places this child's life squarely within the same broad century that saw the height of the Kushan Empire straddling Central Asia and northern India, the twilight years of the Han Dynasty in China, and the height of Roman imperial power in the Mediterranean. Three of the ancient world's great civilizations were near their peak simultaneously, connected to one another, whether they fully realized it or not, by exactly the kind of long-distance maritime and overland trade networks that had already carried this child's ancestors from India to a small river settlement on the far side of the Bay of Bengal. When researchers sequenced the ancient genome and compared it against reference populations from across Asia, the results were unambiguous. This individual carried an estimated 40 to 50% South Asian ancestry, blended with local Southeast Asian genetic heritage. That finding, on its own, would already have been a significant discovery. But its true significance only becomes clear when you compare it against what the earlier, modern DNA-based studies had estimated. Those studies, relying entirely on statistical inference from present-day populations, had placed the beginning of South Asian genetic admixture in Cambodia at somewhere around the 12th or 13th century of the Common Era. The Vat Komnou individual lived and died more than 1,000 years before that estimated date. In other words, actual ancient DNA evidence pushed the confirmed presence of substantial South Asian ancestry in Cambodia back by roughly a millennium compared to what scientists had previously calculated using indirect statistical methods alone. This matters enormously for how historians understand the process of Indianization across Southeast Asia. It suggests that genetic mixing between South Asian and Southeast Asian populations wasn't a gradual, centuries-later consequence of an already established cultural relationship. It was present and substantial from the very earliest stages of contact, right alongside the very first archaeological evidence of Indian cultural influence appearing in the region. The temples, the Sanskrit inscriptions, and the Indian-style political titles that would come to define Angkor-era Cambodia centuries later weren't simply borrowed ideas, adopted secondhand through trade and diplomacy. At least in this case, they arrived alongside actual people who settled, had families, and passed down a substantial share of their genetic ancestry to the children born on Southeast Asian soil. The scale of the admixture found in this single individual is itself worth sitting with for a moment. A person carrying 40 to 50% South Asian ancestry is not someone with a single distant Indian ancestor several generations back. That level of ancestry typically implies a parent or very close ancestor who was themselves substantially or entirely of South Asian descent, evidence not of occasional isolated contact between Indian traders and local Cambodian communities, but of direct, close, and socially significant unions between South Asian migrants and the local population, happening early enough and commonly enough to leave this kind of genetic signature in the archaeological record. So who were these South Asian migrants, and how did they actually get to Cambodia in the first century of the Common Era? The answer lies in one of ancient history's most underappreciated achievements: the maritime trade networks that connected India to Southeast Asia across the Bay of Bengal centuries before European ships ever attempted the journey. Indian merchant vessels, sailing from ports along India's eastern coastline, in regions corresponding to modern-day Odisha, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra Pradesh, had established trade routes across the Bay of Bengal, reaching Southeast Asia well before the start of the Common Era, seeking access to Southeast Asian gold, spices, aromatic woods, and other goods highly valued in Indian, and, through further trade networks, Roman markets. These voyages depended on a sophisticated understanding of seasonal monsoon wind patterns, allowing sailing ships to travel reliably in one direction during one part of the year and return safely during the opposite monsoon season months later, a navigational achievement that predates comparable European transoceanic sailing by well over 1,000 years. Along these trade routes traveled not just goods, but people. Merchants, sailors, and quite likely Brahmin priests and religious specialists, whose presence in early Southeast Asian courts is well documented in later inscriptions and historical accounts. To appreciate just how significant this trading network was, it helps to place it within the wider ancient world it connected. Roman writers of the 1st and 2nd centuries, including the geographer Pliny the Elder, complained bitterly about the vast sums of gold flowing eastward out of the Roman Empire to pay for luxury goods arriving from India: pepper, precious stones, fine textiles, and aromatic resins that Roman elites had come to consider essential status symbols. Much of that same wealth, historians and archaeologists now understand, was fueling a parallel eastward expansion of Indian maritime trade. reaching past Sri Lanka and across the Bay of Bengal toward the Malay Peninsula, the Mekong Delta, and beyond in search of the gold, tin, and aromatic woods that Southeast Asia possessed in abundance. India, in other words, sat at the center of a genuinely global trade network stretching from the Mediterranean in the west to the South China Sea in the east. And the same ships carrying pepper and gems toward Rome were, on their return legs and parallel routes, carrying Indian merchants, sailors, and settlers toward Southeast Asia. Local Funan-era chronicles and later regional legends, including a well-known founding myth involving an Indian Brahmin figure named Kaundinya, who is said to have married a local Cambodian princess and founded the ruling dynasty of Funan, hint at exactly this kind of early socially significant intermarriage between arriving South Asian migrants and local Southeast Asian elites. For generations, this founding legend was treated by many historians as exactly that, legend, a symbolic story rather than literal history. The genetic evidence recovered from Vat Komnou doesn't prove the Kaundinya legend happened precisely as later chronicles describe it, but it does confirm something that legend had been suggesting all along, that early Funan-era Cambodia included people of substantial, direct South Asian ancestry, intermarried closely enough with the local population to leave exactly the kind of genetic signature a founding story like Kaundinya's would predict. What happened after this early period of contact is, in many ways, just as revealing as the discovery itself. The Funan kingdom that the Vat Komnou child was born into eventually gave way, centuries later, to the Khmer Empire, the civilization responsible for building Angkor Wat, still the largest religious monument on Earth, and a structure whose architecture, iconography, and religious purpose draw directly and unmistakably from Hindu and later Buddhist traditions imported from India. By the time Angkor Wat was constructed in the early 12th century, Indian cultural influence in the region had been accumulating for roughly 1,000 years, a full millennium of continuous contact, absorption, and local adaptation, beginning, as far as the genetic record now shows, with intimate family unions like the one that produced the Vat Komnou child, and continuing through waves of subsequent Brahmin migration, royal marriage alliances, and religious pilgrimage that historical inscriptions across the region continue to document well into the medieval period. The temple walls of Angkor, in a very real sense, are the architectural descendants of exactly the kind of genetic and cultural union this single ancient genome captured in its earliest possible form. This single genome from Cambodia also fits into a much larger, still developing picture of ancient DNA research across South and Southeast Asia, a picture that keeps revealing the same underlying pattern in different forms. Just as the landmark 2019 study of 524 ancient genomes across South Asia revealed that the region's own population formed through multiple layered waves of migration, rather than a single simple story, the ancient DNA record now emerging from Southeast Asia is revealing that the Indianization of the region wasn't a single uniform cultural process either. Different communities across Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam appear to have experienced South Asian contact and admixture at different times, in different amounts, and through different specific historical circumstances. Some through direct, close intermarriage occurring as early as the first few centuries of the Common Era, as the Vat Komnou individual demonstrates, and others through more gradual lower-level genetic contact accumulating over many subsequent centuries, exactly as the earlier modern population studies had suggested for groups further from the earliest maritime trade hubs. It's worth understanding, too, exactly what made up the other half of the Vat Komnou child's ancestry, the local Southeast Asian component that combined with South Asian heritage to produce this individual. Ancient DNA research across the wider region has shown that Southeast Asia's own population, prior to Indian contact, was itself already the product of multiple ancient migratory layers. The earliest inhabitants of the region descended from Hoabinhian hunter-gatherer populations, present across Southeast Asia for tens of thousands of years, whose remains have been recovered from cave sites in Malaysia, Laos, and elsewhere, despite the region's notoriously difficult preservation conditions. Beginning several thousand years ago, waves of East Asian farming populations moved south into the region, bringing rice cultivation and gradually mixing with the existing hunter-gatherer population to produce the genetic base found across much of Cambodia and its neighboring countries by the time Indian traders and settlers began arriving. The Vat Komnou child, in other words, represents the meeting point of two already layered ancestral stories. An Indian lineage shaped by its own multi-thousand-year history of Iranian farmer and Central Asian steppe admixture, meeting a Southeast Asian lineage shaped by its own multi-thousand-year history of Hoabinhian and East Asian farmer admixture, two deeply complex ancestral rivers converging in the body of a single child. In a small river settlement roughly 2,000 years ago, there's a broader significance to this finding that extends well beyond Cambodia's own history, one that connects directly back to how scientists now understand India's own ancient role in the wider world. For much of the 20th century, popular understanding of ancient Indian history tended to focus inward on the rise and fall of successive dynasties across the subcontinent itself, from the Mauryan Empire through the Gupta period and beyond. The genetic evidence emerging from sites like Vat Komnou tells a complementary, outward-facing story. That ancient India, particularly during the crucial centuries at the turn of the Common Era, was not simply a subject of external migration and cultural influence, as the earlier Aryan migration narrative once emphasized almost exclusively, but was itself an active source of migration and cultural influence, extending thousands of kilometers across the Bay of Bengal, reaching deep into Southeast Asia, and leaving a measurable genetic legacy that persists in some Southeast Asian populations even today. That legacy, once established, appears to have continued accumulating for many centuries afterward, layer upon layer, much like the internal migratory history of India itself. Modern population studies across Southeast Asia continue to detect South Asian genetic ancestry in varying proportions across different ethnic groups, with statistically estimated admixture dates ranging from the 4th century for some populations, in Vietnam all the way through the 16th century for certain communities in Myanmar, a spread of well over 1,000 years, suggesting that Indian contact with Southeast Asia wasn't a single historical event, but an extended centuries-long process of trade, migration, religious exchange, and intermarriage, of which the Vat Komnou individual represents simply the earliest confirmed genetic snapshot scientists have managed to recover so far. For researchers working in this field, the significance of a single ancient genome, however striking, always comes with an important caveat. One individual cannot, on its own, definitively prove the genetic history of an entire ancient population or region. The Vat Komnou child could, in principle, represent an unusual individual case, rather than a broader pattern, perhaps the son or daughter of a single prominent Indian family living in an otherwise less mixed local community. Scientists studying this period are candid about this limitation, and it's precisely why ongoing ancient DNA research across Southeast Asia continues to prioritize recovering additional ancient genomes from the same early period, hoping to determine whether the level of admixture found in this one child was broadly representative of the wider Funan population, or whether it represented a genuinely exceptional case. Southeast Asia's tropical climate remains a persistent obstacle to that research, degrading ancient DNA far more aggressively than the cooler, drier conditions found in much of Europe or Central Asia, meaning every successfully recovered ancient genome from the region represents a genuine achievement against difficult scientific odds. Even with that caveat firmly in place, the discovery stands as a rare and valuable data point confirming something historians had long suspected but struggled to prove directly, that the cultural transformation of early Southeast Asia was, at least in part, a story of people, not just ideas. Sanskrit inscriptions can travel through trade and translation without a single migrant ever setting foot on foreign soil. Temple architecture can be copied and adapted by local artisans who never met an Indian visitor in their lives. But a 2,000-year-old child's genome carrying 40 to 50% South Asian ancestry cannot be explained by trade and translation alone. It requires people, specific, real people who crossed the Bay of Bengal, settled among a foreign population, and had children whose ancestry, quite literally, carried half a world's history within it. This discovery also offers a useful corrective to a framing of ancient Indian history that has, for generations, leaned almost entirely in one direction. Much of the 20th century conversation about ancient migration into and out of the Indian subcontinent, including the long-debated Aryan migration question explored elsewhere in this channel's coverage, has focused on who arrived in India and when and from where. The Vat Komnou child flips that framing on its head and asks a different, less commonly discussed question. Not who came to India, but who left it and what they built once they arrived somewhere new. It's a genuinely underexplored side of ancient Indian history, and one that ancient DNA research is only now beginning to give scientists the tools to properly investigate. India's story, this evidence suggests, was never purely a story of absorption. It was also, from a remarkably early period, a story of expansion, of Indian families crossing oceans, founding dynasties, and leaving genetic legacies in lands thousands of kilometers from home, long before anyone had coined a name for the country they had left behind. For the millions of people across modern Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, and the wider Southeast Asian mainland, whose ancestry, whether they know it or not, carries some measurable trace of this ancient South Asian migration, the Vat Komnou discovery offers something more personal than an academic footnote. It offers a physical, scientifically verified starting point for a genetic story that had, until recently, existed only in the form of legend, inscription, and architectural inference. Somewhere in the deep genetic history of a portion of Southeast Asia's population sits a real, specific, datable moment. A child born in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, in a river settlement in what is now Cambodia, carrying within their own body the physical proof of an ocean successfully crossed, a family successfully built, and a legacy that modern genetic science, 2,000 years later, finally managed to read. There's one more detail worth sitting with before this story closes, because it says something about the nature of scientific discovery itself. This finding didn't come from a dramatic new excavation, or a previously unknown lost city suddenly unearthed by archaeologists. The skeleton had been sitting, catalogued, and stored in the archaeological record for years before the genetic technology needed to properly read its ancient DNA had caught up with the sample itself. The real breakthrough here wasn't the discovery of the child's remains. It was the moment, years later, when laboratory techniques for extracting and sequencing degraded ancient DNA from a tropical climate finally became reliable enough to unlock the genetic story that had been sitting quietly in that skeleton the entire time. As similar techniques continue to improve, researchers expect more stories like this one to emerge from archaeological collections already sitting in museums and universities across Southeast Asia, meaning the full genetic history of India's ancient reach across the Bay of Bengal may still be only partially told, with new evidence waiting to be read from bones that have already been found, simply waiting for the science to finally catch up to what they've been carrying all along. Consider, too, how this single discovery reframes something as familiar as a temple carving or a Sanskrit inscription. Tourists walking through Angkor Wat today, or through any of the hundreds of smaller Hindu and Buddhist temple sites scattered across mainland Southeast Asia, are typically told a story about cultural transmission, about ideas, religious texts, and artistic styles traveling across the sea and being adopted by local rulers eager to legitimize their power through association with Indian civilization. That story remains true and important, but it is no longer the complete story. Somewhere beneath those same temple foundations, in burial sites archaeologists have not yet excavated, or in skeletal remains already sitting uncatalogued in regional museum collections, almost certainly lie more descendants of exactly the kind of union the Vat Komnou child represents: physical, biological proof that the empire of ideas Indian civilization built across Southeast Asia was, at its very foundation, also an empire of people. That is the discovery scientists made when they finally sequenced ancient DNA from Cambodia, rather than relying on modern populations alone. Not simply confirmation that India and Southeast Asia had contact in the ancient world. Historians already knew that much from inscriptions, temples, and trade records, but direct physical proof that this contact, from its very earliest documented stages, involved real people crossing an ocean, settling permanently, and building families whose descendants carried Indian ancestry in their DNA a full millennium earlier than anyone studying the region's modern population genetics had ever calculated. Indian identity, this single ancient genome quietly confirms, was never confined to the subcontinent that gave it its name. It had already crossed the sea and taken root an ocean away, before most of Indian history, as it's commonly taught, had even begun to unfold. A legacy carried not in any surviving text or inscription, but in the quiet, patient evidence of a child's bones, waiting nearly 2,000 years to finally tell their story.